Boone Cartwright had buried his wife 30 years ago and never looked at another woman since. Until the day 10 mail-order brides showed up at his door, all holding the same letter with his name on it. The 62-year-old rancher stood on his porch, watching dust settle around their worn boots and tired faces. A bookkeeping mistake in Boston had sent them all to his Silver Spur Ranch, each woman believing she was the only bride coming to marry the lonely cowboy. These weren't young girls chasing fairy tales. They were women who'd known heartbreak, raised children, and buried dreams, now seeking one last chance at happiness on the Wyoming prairie. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his land, Boone realized his quiet world was about to change forever. 10 determined women had traveled 1,000 miles to start over, and they weren't about to turn back now. What happens when a man who's forgotten how to love meets 10 women who refuse to give up on it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the Silver Spur Ranch. Boone Cartwright had been awake since before dawn, as was his custom for the past 3 decades. The ritual never changed: black coffee strong enough to wake the dead, a slow walk to the barn to check on the horses, then out to the pasture where his cattle grazed on the endless prairie grass. At 62, Boone's face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent his life under the open sky. His silver beard, neatly trimmed, caught the early light as he surveyed his domain. 3,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Wyoming stretched as far as the eye could see, bordered by the Medicine Bow Mountains to the west and rolling hills to the east. The ranch house, built with his own hands 40 years ago, sat sturdy and proud against the landscape, a testament to dreams once shared and now carried alone. Inside the barn, his favorite mare, Patience, nickered softly as he approached. She'd been Clara's horse, a gentle chestnut with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the weight of memories. Boone ran his weathered hand along her neck, feeling the familiar comfort of routine. "Morning, old girl," he murmured, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who spent more time talking to animals than people. Another day, another dollar, as they say. The barn held 30 years of accumulated silence. Tools hung in their designated places, hay bales stacked with military precision, everything exactly as it should be. Order and routine had become Boone's salvation after Clara's death. When the doctors couldn't save her or their unborn child, when the preacher's words fell hollow as stones, when the neighbors' casseroles stopped coming, that's when Boone learned that a man could survive on routine and solitude. He'd loved Clara Whitmore from the moment he'd seen her at the church social in Cheyenne. She was 19, with honey-colored hair and a laugh that could charm birds from trees. He was 28, already established with his ranch, ready to build a life with the right woman. They'd courted for 6 months before he'd worked up the courage to ask her father for her hand. Their wedding day had been the happiest of his life, Clara radiant in her mother's ivory dress, promising to love him until death did them part. Death had come too soon, taking both Clara and their hopes for children in one cruel winter night. The midwife had done everything she could, but sometimes the prairie claimed what it wanted, regardless of prayers or wishes. Boone had buried them both in the little cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, where the wildflowers bloomed every spring and the wind sang through the grass. After that, he'd thrown himself into the work. The ranch grew from a modest spread to one of the most successful in the territory. He'd hired good men Jake Morrison, a steady hand with cattle, and Tommy Chen, whose family had come west to work the railroad and stayed to work the land. They understood Boone's need for quiet, respecting his solitude while ensuring the ranch prospered. The house remained exactly as Clara had left it. Her china tea set still sat in the kitchen cabinet, her books lined the shelves in the parlor, her sewing basket gathered dust by the window where she'd loved to sit and watch the sunset. Some folks called it unhealthy, holding on to the past like that, but Boone figured a man had a right to his memories. Now, As he made his way back to the house for breakfast, something felt different about the morning. The air carried a tension he couldn't name, like the feeling before a storm when the animals grew restless and the wind shifted directions. His cattle seemed more alert than usual, their heads raised as they gazed toward the main road that led to town. Inside the kitchen, Boone went through his morning routine. Bacon in the cast-iron skillet, eggs from his own hens, bread baked fresh every few days. He ate alone at the long wooden table he'd built to seat 8, though only one chair had been occupied for 30 years. The silence was comfortable, familiar as an old coat. It was while he was washing dishes that he heard the distant rumble of wagon wheels on the dirt road. Visitors were rare at the Silver Spur. Most folks who had business with him knew to come during the day, and the mailman usually arrived on Tuesdays. This was Thursday, and the sun was barely clearing the horizon. Boone dried his hands on the kitchen towel and stepped onto the front porch. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the creak of leather and the soft murmur of voices. Not one voice, but many. His brow furrowed as he shaded his eyes against the morning sun, trying to make out the approaching party. The wagon that came into view was unlike anything he'd expected. It was a large passenger conveyance, the kind used to transport folks between towns, pulled by 4 sturdy horses. But it was the passengers that made Boone's heart skip a beat. Women, 10 of them, ranging in age from what looked like early 30s to perhaps 50, all dressed in their traveling clothes, all staring at his ranch with expressions of hope and determination. The wagon driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, called out as they approached, "You Boone Cartwright?" "I am," Boone replied, his voice steady despite the confusion building in his chest. "Got a delivery for you," the driver said, climbing down from his perch. 10 ladies, all the way from Boston. They got letters saying you sent for them." Boone felt the world tilt sideways. He gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. There's been a mistake. But the women were already climbing down from the wagon, each one clutching a piece of paper. The first to approach was a woman with auburn hair streaked with silver, her green eyes direct and unflinching. She held up her letter with the confidence of someone who'd traveled 1,000 miles on faith alone. "Mr. Cartwright," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of education and breeding. "I'm Martha Sullivan. I believe you've been expecting me." Behind her, the other women gathered, a tall blonde with calloused hands that spoke of hard work, a petite brunette with gentle eyes, a woman with graying hair who carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. Each face told a story of hope and determination, of women who'd left everything behind for the promise of a new life. In Martha's weathered hand, Boone could see the edge of a gold wedding ring, worn thin from years of wear. As she spoke, she unconsciously twisted it on her finger, a gesture that spoke of loss and the courage to love again. The other women clustered around her, their own letters held like talismans against uncertainty. "There's been a mistake," Boone repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. The women before him had traveled too far and sacrificed too much to be turned away by simple words. Martha's expression softened with understanding. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside, Mr. Cartwright. These ladies have come a very long way, and I suspect there's more to this situation than any of us understand." The morning sun climbed higher, casting the scene in golden light. Boone looked at the faces before him, weathered by life, but not broken by it, hopeful despite the obvious confusion, determined in the way that only women who'd survived hardship could be. For the first time in 30 years, his empty ranch was full of possibility. And for the first time in 30 years, Boone Cartwright didn't know what to do about it. The parlor had never felt smaller than it did, with 10 women seated in every available chair, on the settee, and even perched on the ottoman Clara had embroidered with wildflowers. Boone stood by the window, his back to the assembled group, staring out at the familiar landscape that suddenly seemed foreign, with so many unfamiliar voices filling his sanctuary. Martha Sullivan had taken charge of the situation with the natural authority of a woman accustomed to organizing chaos. She'd introduced each of the women in turn: Ruth Henley, a widow from Philadelphia with steady hands and kind eyes; Elizabeth Crawford, whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with grown children who no longer needed her; Sarah Mitchell, who'd lost her farm to debt and decided to start fresh rather than burden her relatives. The stories continued around the room. Agnes Murphy, a schoolteacher whose position had been eliminated when the town's children grew scarce; Helen Torres, whose husband had abandoned her for a younger woman, leaving her to face the shame and whispers alone; Mary Cheno, relation to his ranch hand Tommy, despite the shared surname, whose late husband's family had made it clear she was no longer welcome after his passing. Each woman held a letter identical to the others, all bearing Boone's name and the address of the Silver Spur Ranch. The correspondence, written on official letterhead from the Boston Marriage Bureau, promised a comfortable home, a kind husband, and the chance for a fresh start in the Wyoming territory. "I never sent for any mail-order brides," Boone said finally, turning to face the room. His voice was steady, but Martha could see the storm building behind his grey eyes. "This is some kind of mistake, and you ladies need to understand that." The youngest of the women, Sarah Mitchell, spoke up with a tremor in her voice. "But we've sold everything, Mr. Cartwright. Our homes, our possessions. We used every penny we had for the train fare and the stagecoach ride out here." "That's not my problem," Boone replied, though the words felt harsh even to his own ears. "I didn't invite you here, and I can't be responsible for someone else's error." Martha stood slowly, her presence commanding attention without raising her voice. She was perhaps 45, with the bearing of a woman who'd managed a household and weathered life's storms with grace intact. "Mr. Cartwright, might I speak with you privately?" The other women exchanged glances, but remained silent as Martha followed Boone into the kitchen. She closed the door softly behind her, then turned to face him with eyes that had seen too much to be easily intimidated. "You're a good man," she said simply. "I can see it in how you maintain this place, in the respect your ranch hands show you, in the fact that you've invited us inside instead of leaving us standing in the dust." "You don't know anything about me," Boone replied, but his tone lacked the heat it had held moments before. Martha smiled sadly and pulled a photograph from her reticule, a man in uniform, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This was my husband, Thomas. He died at Antietam when I was 26. I spent the next 19 years raising our daughter alone, watching her grow up and marry and move to California with her husband's family." She tucked the photograph away and met Boone's eyes directly. "I know what it's like to live with ghosts, Mr. Cartwright. I know how a house can feel too big and too small at the same time. I know how the silence can be both a comfort and a curse." The crumpled letter in her hand, the same letter that had brought them all here, rustled as she smoothed it against her skirt. The paper was worn from handling, creased from being folded and unfolded countless times during the long journey west. "These women in your parlor," Martha continued, "they're not here because they're desperate or foolish. They're here because they still believe in the possibility of happiness, even after life has given them every reason to stop believing." Boone felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "I buried my wife 30 years ago," he said quietly. "I'm not looking for another one. And yet here we are." Martha replied with gentle persistence. 10 women who've traveled across a continent on the strength of a letter that bears your name. Surely that means something, even if it wasn't intended. Through the kitchen window, Boone could see Jake Morrison approaching the house, probably wondering about the wagon and the commotion. In a few hours, the whole territory would know about the 10 women who'd shown up at the Silver Spur Ranch. The thought made his stomach clench with anxiety. "The next stagecoach to Cheyenne comes through on Saturday," he said finally. "That's 3 days from now. You ladies can stay until then, but after that, you'll need to make other arrangements." Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd won the first battle in a war. Boone didn't even realize he was fighting. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Cartwright. We'll need to discuss sleeping arrangements and meals, of course. The bunkhouse has space," Boone said quickly, then realized how that sounded. I mean, Jake and Tommy can sleep in the barn. The bunkhouse is clean and has good beds. Of course, Martha agreed solemnly, though Boone caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. When they returned to the parlor, the other women looked up expectantly. Ruth Henley was examining Clara's books with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of knowledge. Elizabeth Crawford had noticed the family photographs on the mantelpiece and was studying them with respectful curiosity. Mr. Cartwright has graciously agreed to let us stay until Saturday, Martha announced. The next stagecoach will take us back to Cheyenne, where we can make arrangements to return east. The silence that followed was heavy with disappointment, and something deeper, the crushing weight of dreams, deferred once again. Sarah Mitchell's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. Agnes Murphy stared at her hands, already calculating how she might start over with nothing for the second time in her life. Well then, Ruth Henley said with forced brightness, we'd best make the most of our time here. Perhaps we can be of some help around the ranch while we're imposing on Mr. Cartwright's hospitality. Boone wanted to protest that they weren't imposing, that he didn't need help, that he'd managed just fine on his own for 3 decades, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself nodding curtly and excusing himself to speak with his ranch hands. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and approaching autumn. Jake Morrison was waiting by the corral, his weathered face creased with curiosity and concern. "Boss?" Jake said simply, a question contained in the single word. "Mistake with a marriage bureau back east," Boone explained. "They'll be gone by Saturday." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward the house where feminine voices could be heard, through the open windows, the first such sounds the ranch had heard in 30 years. "Shame," Jake said finally. "Place could use some life in it." As Boone watched his foreman walk away, he realized that the comfortable routine of his solitary life had been shattered as completely as if a tornado had torn through his world. 3 days until the stagecoach came. 3 days to get his life back to normal. 3 days that suddenly felt both too long and not nearly long enough. By the time Boone emerged from the barn the next morning, the women had already transformed his ranch in ways he couldn't have imagined. The scent of bacon and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, while voice-actual human voice carried on the morning breeze. For a man who'd grown accustomed to the exclusive company of cattle and horses, the change was as jarring as a thunderclap in clear skies. Martha Sullivan stood on the front porch, shaking out a rug with the efficient motions of someone who understood the value of keeping a proper house. She'd changed from her traveling dress into a simple work outfit that spoke of practicality over fashion, her auburn hair pinned back in a no-nonsense bun. "Good morning, Mr. Cartwright," she called out, her voice carrying that same steady confidence that had impressed him the day before. "I hope you don't mind that we took the liberty of preparing breakfast. It seemed the least we could do." Behind her, Ruth Henley appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron she'd somehow procured. "The coffee's fresh," she added with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "And there's plenty for everyone." Boone hesitated on the threshold of his own home. The kitchen had always been his domain in the mornings, quiet, orderly, sufficient for his needs. Now it bustled with activity that made his chest tighten with memories he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. Agnes Murphy sat at his table, reading aloud from yesterday's newspaper to Elizabeth Crawford, who was mending what looked like one of Jake's torn shirts. Sarah Mitchell stood at the stove, turning bacon with the careful attention of someone who understood that wasting food was a sin against Providence. "We found your wife's china in the cabinet," Ruth said gently, noticing his hesitation. "Martha thought you might prefer we use the everyday dishes, but they're so beautiful. Clara had exquisite taste." The mention of Clara's name hit Boone like a physical blow. The china tea set delicate roses on cream-colored porcelain had been Clara's pride and joy, a wedding gift from her mother back in Philadelphia. He'd kept it locked away in the cabinet for 3 decades, unable to bear the sight of it but unwilling to pack it away completely. "She did," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "She did have fine taste." Martha stepped closer, her green eyes soft with understanding. "We only use the everyday plates," she assured him. "The china is too precious for daily use." But as Boone looked around his transformed kitchen, he realized the women had done more than simply prepare a meal. Someone had swept the floor until it gleamed, organized the pantry with military precision, and hung fresh dish towels by the sink. The room felt lived in for the first time in decades, warm with the kind of domestic energy he'd almost forgotten existed. Helen Torres entered from the back door, carrying a basket of eggs and wearing a smile that transformed her careworn features. "Your hens are excellent layers, Mr. Cartwright, and someone's been taking good care of them." "That would be Tommy," Boone replied, accepting a cup of coffee from Ruth with reluctant gratitude. "He's got away with animals." "We met him earlier," Sarah said from the stove. "Lovely young man. He was worried we might not have enough blankets for the bunkhouse, so he brought extras from the main barn." The coffee was perfect, strong without being bitter, hot without being scalding. Boone found himself wondering when he'd last tasted coffee that hadn't been made by his own hands, then immediately felt guilty for enjoying it. Agnes looked up from the newspaper with the bright expression of someone sharing interesting news. "There's to be a harvest dance in town next week. The whole territory's invited, according to this announcement. Boone never goes to the dances." Jake Morrison's voice came from the doorway, where he stood hat in hand, clearly uncertain about entering the suddenly feminine domain of the kitchen. "Morning, ladies, boss." "Come in, Mr. Morrison," Martha said warmly. "There's plenty of breakfast, and you look like a man who could use a good meal." Jake glanced at Boone, who nodded reluctantly. As his foreman settled at the table, Boone noticed how the women automatically made space, included him in their conversation, treated him like family rather than hired help. It was the kind of unconscious hospitality that spoke of good breeding and kind hearts. "Why don't you attend the dances, Mr. Cartwright?" Elizabeth asked with genuine curiosity. "They sound quite pleasant." Boone set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Never saw the point in them." The silence that followed was pointed but not uncomfortable. These women understood, Boone realized, the weight of grief and the way it could make simple pleasures feel like betrayals of the past. Mary Chen entered through the front door, her arms full of wildflowers she'd apparently gathered from the fields. "I hope you don't mind," she said to Boone, but the house seemed like it could use some color. Before he could protest, she'd begun arranging the flowers in one of Clara's vases, not the precious crystal ones, but a simple ceramic piece that had sat empty on the windowsill for 30 years. The purple asters and goldenrod transformed the kitchen, bringing the prairie inside in a way that made the space feel alive. "Clara loved wildflowers," Boone said quietly, then immediately regretted the admission. Talking about Clara made her absence feel fresh again, like a wound that refused to heal properly. "I can see why," Mary replied with gentle understanding. "There's something honest about them, don't you think? They grow where they're planted and make the best of whatever soil they find." Tommy Chen appeared at the back door, his usual morning greeting for Boone dying on his lips as he took in the transformed kitchen. His eyes widened as he noticed Mary arranging flowers, and Boone caught something in the young man's expression that suggested more than casual interest. "Tommy, come meet the ladies," Martha said, taking charge of the introductions with the ease of a natural hostess. "This is Mary Chenwat, a coincidence that you share a surname." "Different families," Tommy said quickly, his face reddening. "Chen's not uncommon where my folks came from." Mary smiled at him with the kind of warmth that made Tommy forget his usual shyness around strangers. "It's still nice to meet someone who understands the challenges of making a home in a new place." As Boone watched the easy interaction between his ranch hand and the woman arranging his late wife's vase, he felt something shift inside his chest, not quite jealousy, but a recognition that life was moving forward, whether he wanted it to or not. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating faces that were no longer strange but not yet familiar. In the space of 24 hours, these women had made themselves useful, comfortable, and somehow essential to the daily rhythm of the ranch. And that, Boone realized with growing alarm, was exactly what he'd been afraid of. The accident happened just after noon on their second day at the ranch. Jake Morrison was mending fence in the south pasture when his horse shied at a rattlesnake, throwing him hard against a fence post. Tommy found him 20 minutes later, conscious but with a gash on his forehead that was bleeding freely and his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. "Get Ruth!" Martha called out as Tommy helped Jake toward the house, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Ruth Henley, she's in the garden behind the kitchen." Boone emerged from the barn at a run, his heart hammering with the kind of fear that came from years of knowing how quickly things could go wrong on a ranch. But as he reached the porch, he stopped short at the sight that greeted him. Ruth Henley had taken complete control of the situation with the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen her share of medical emergencies. She'd cleared the kitchen table and was laying out supplies from a leather medical bag that looked well used and carefully maintained. "Bring him here," she instructed Tommy, her voice carrying absolute authority. "And someone boil water, lots of it." Sarah Mitchell was already stoking the fire under the largest pot, while Agnes Murphy tore clean cloth into strips for bandages. Elizabeth Crawford held Jake's good arm, murmuring reassuring words as Ruth examined his injuries with gentle but thorough hands. "The arm's broken, but it's a clean break," Ruth announced after her examination. "The head wound looks worse than it is scalp wounds, always bleed like the devil. Mr. Morrison, you're going to be fine, but you'll need to take things easy for the next few weeks." Boone watched in amazement as Ruth worked, her movements sure and practiced. She cleaned the head wound with gentle precision, then set about splinting Jake's arm with materials the women had somehow produced from thin air. "You're a doctor," he said, though it came out more like a question. Ruth smiled without looking up from her work. "Not officially, but I've been caring for the sick and injured for 20 years. My late husband was a physician in Philadelphia, and I learned at his side. When he died, I discovered that being a woman made my knowledge less valuable in the eyes of most folks." "She delivered half the babies in our neighborhood," Helen Torres added, holding a basin of clean water for Ruth to use, "and saved twice as many lives as the official doctor ever did." Jake winced as Ruth secured the splint, but his color was already improving. "Much obliged, ma'am. Haven't felt care like that since my mother passed." "You'll be right as rain in 6 weeks," Ruth assured him, washing her hands in the basin. "But no heavy lifting, no riding, and definitely no fence work. Doctor's orders." The implications of Jake's injury hit Boone like a physical blow. His foreman was the backbone of the ranch's daily operations, especially with autumn roundup approaching. 6 weeks without Jake's expertise would be catastrophic, particularly since they were already short-handed. Martha seemed to read his thoughts. "Is there much that needs doing around the ranch?" she asked casually, as if the question were purely conversational. "Harvest's coming," Boone replied, his mind already calculating the work that lay ahead. "Hay to cut and store, cattle to move to winter pasture, fences to repair before the snow comes." "Well then," Martha said with the tone of someone making a simple decision, "I suppose we'll need to help out." "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but ranch work isn't—" "Isn't what?" Agnes Murphy interrupted, her schoolteacher's voice carrying just enough edge to command attention. "Isn't suitable for women? I'll have you know, I managed my father's farm for 15 years before I took up teaching. And I ran a boarding house that included a stable and kitchen garden," Helen added. "I know my way around livestock and hard work." Mary Chen looked up from where she was helping Ruth pack away her medical supplies. "My family grew vegetables for the railroad camps. I can handle any kind of farming you need done." Boone felt the walls of his carefully ordered world crumbling around him. These women weren't just offering to help, they were demonstrating capabilities he'd never imagined they possessed. Ruth's medical skills had probably saved Jake from a much more serious injury, and now the others were volunteering to take on the physical demands of ranch work. "It's not that simple," he protested weakly. "Ranch work is dangerous. The cattle, the horses, the weather. More dangerous than traveling 1,000 miles to marry a stranger?" Sarah Mitchell asked with a slight smile. "More dangerous than starting over with nothing but hope and determination." Elizabeth Crawford, who'd been quietly comforting Jake, spoke up with the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Mr. Cartwright, these ladies have survived things that would break weaker souls. A little ranch work isn't going to frighten us." Tommy, who'd been unusually quiet during the medical emergency, cleared his throat. "Boss, if you don't mind me saying, we could use the help. And from what I've seen, these ladies know what they're about." Boone looked around the kitchen at Ruth, calmly cleaning her medical instruments, at Martha organizing the remaining bandages with military efficiency, at the other women who'd responded to the crisis with competence and grace. In less than 2 days, they'd proven themselves more capable than many ranch hands he'd known. "Saturday," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of surrender. "The stagecoach comes on Saturday." "Of course," Martha agreed, but her tone suggested they both knew that Saturday was looking less certain with every passing hour. As the afternoon wore on, Boone found himself watching the women with growing amazement. Agnes and Helen worked together to prepare a hearty soup for supper, their movements coordinated like dancers who'd practiced the same routine for years. Sarah and Mary disappeared to tend the vegetable garden they'd discovered behind the house, returning with armloads of produce that would have taken Boone weeks to notice, much less harvest. Elizabeth sat with Jake, reading to him from one of Clara's books while he rested. Her voice was soothing, cultured, the kind of voice that spoke of education and refinement. Yet she'd rolled up her sleeves without hesitation when Ruth needed help with the medical emergency. As evening approached, Boone stood on his front porch, watching the sun set over his familiar landscape. But the ranch no longer felt familiar. It felt alive in a way it hadn't for 30 years, filled with voices and laughter and the sound of women going about the business of making a house into a home. Martha joined him on the porch, her presence comfortable rather than intrusive. "It's a beautiful place," she said simply. "Clara must have loved it here." "She did," Boone replied, surprised to find that talking about Clara no longer felt like reopening a wound. "She always said the sunsets here were God's way of saying goodnight to the world." Martha smiled, and for a moment they stood together in companionable silence, watching the sky turn gold and crimson above the prairie. "Saturday," Boone said again, but the word had lost its certainty. "Saturday," Martha agreed, but neither of them believed it anymore. The storm struck on their third night at the ranch with the sudden fury that only Wyoming weather could muster. What had been a clear evening sky turned black within minutes, the wind rising from a whisper to a howl that rattled every window in the house. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white lines, followed by thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. Boone woke to the sound of hail hammering against his bedroom window like rifle shots. He'd weathered enough prairie storms to know this one was going to be bad, the kind that could scatter cattle across 3 counties and tear roofs off buildings that had stood for decades. He dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, expecting to find the house dark and quiet. Instead, he discovered the kitchen blazing with lamplight and activity. The women were already up and moving with the practiced efficiency of people who understood emergencies. Martha stood by the window, watching the storm's approach with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a military situation. "How bad do these get?" she asked as Boone entered. "Bad enough," he replied, reaching for his coat and hat. "I need to get to the barn, make sure the animals are secure." "You're not going out there alone," Ruth said firmly from where she was checking her medical bag. "If someone gets hurt, you'll need help." Before Boone could protest, Tommy burst through the back door, his clothes already soaked despite the short run from the bunkhouse. "Boss, the cattle in the north pasture are spooked. Some of the fence is down already, and they're looking to bolt." Agnes Murphy stepped forward, surprising everyone. "I can ride," she said simply, "and I know cattle. My father ran 200 head back in Illinois." "Ma'am, this isn't," Tommy started. "Weather to send a woman out in." Agnes finished with a smile that held steel beneath its gentleness. "Young man, I've ridden through blizzards that would freeze a lesser soul solid. A little rain won't hurt me." Elizabeth Crawford was already pulling on a heavy coat she'd somehow acquired. "I'll come with you. 2 riders are better than 1 in weather like this." Boone felt his control of the situation slipping away like sand through his fingers. "This is my ranch, my responsibility. And these are our lives," Martha interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests with quiet authority. "We're here, Mr. Cartwright. We're capable. And whether you like it or not, we're going to help." The next few hours passed in a blur of wind, rain, and desperate activity. Boone found himself working alongside women who proved as tough and resourceful as any ranch hands he'd ever known. Agnes and Elizabeth rode out into the storm with Tommy, their figures disappearing into the darkness as they worked to keep the cattle from scattering. Sarah and Mary battened down everything that could be secured, their movements sure despite the howling wind. Helen and Ruth worked together to prepare hot food and coffee for when the riders returned, understanding that warmth and sustenance would be crucial. Martha stayed by Boone's side as they fought to keep the barn doors secure against the wind. A massive gust caught one door as they were trying to close it, nearly slamming Martha against the barn wall. Without thinking, Boone caught her, pulling her against his chest as the door crashed shut behind them. For a moment, they stood pressed together in the sudden quiet of the barn, both breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. Boone was acutely aware of Martha's warmth against him, the scent of rain in her hair, the way her heart hammered against his chest. It had been 30 years since he'd held a woman. 30 years since he'd felt the simple comfort of another human being's touch. "Thank you," Martha said softly, looking up at him with eyes that held understanding rather than embarrassment. Boone released her reluctantly, stepping back with an awkwardness that made him feel like a schoolboy. "Couldn't let you get hurt," he mumbled, then immediately cursed himself for the inadequate words. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the ranch, but inside the barn, surrounded by the familiar sounds of horses and cattle settling nervously in their stalls, something had shifted between them. The careful distance Boone had maintained since their arrival had been swept away as surely as the storm had scattered the clouds. "Your wife," Martha said suddenly. "Clara, you loved her very much." It wasn't a question, and Boone found himself answering with honesty that surprised him. "More than life itself. When she died, I thought the world had ended." Martha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I felt the same when I lost Thomas. The silence was the worst part coming home to a house that no longer held laughter or conversation or even the simple sound of someone else breathing." "How did you—" Boone started, then stopped, unsure how to ask the question that had been haunting him since the women's arrival. "How did I learn to live again?" Martha finished gently, very slowly, very carefully, and only when I finally understood that loving Thomas didn't mean I had to stop living. The barn door rattled against its hinges, reminding them both that the storm was far from over. But as they worked together to secure the remaining animals, Boone found himself stealing glances at Martha's face in the lamplight, noting the determination in her expression, the competence in her movements, the way she seemed to fit naturally into the rhythm of ranch life. When Agnes, Elizabeth, and Tommy finally returned, they were soaked to the skin but triumphant. They'd managed to keep most of the cattle together and had temporarily repaired the damaged fence with materials scrounged from the storm's debris. "Lost, maybe a dozen head," Agnes reported as she stripped off her wet coat. "But considering what that storm threw at us, it could have been much worse." Elizabeth was wringing water from her hair, her refined appearance transformed by the night's work into something more practical and earthy. "Your cattle are well trained, Mr. Cartwright. They wanted to come home once we got them pointed in the right direction." Ruth had hot soup and dry clothes waiting for the returning riders, her medical bag at the ready in case of injuries. But aside from a few cuts and bruises, everyone had come through the storm unscathed. As the women gathered around the kitchen table, sharing the hot soup and recounting the night's adventures, Boone realized he was witnessing something he'd forgotten could exist. The easy camaraderie of people who'd faced danger together and emerged stronger for it. In her coat pocket, Elizabeth carried a torn photograph that had somehow survived the storm, a picture of her deceased husband that she'd brought west as a reminder of love that endured beyond death. As she carefully dried the photograph by the fire, Boone understood that these women, like him, were carrying their own ghosts, their own memories of love and loss. But unlike him, they hadn't let those ghosts stop them from living. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant, the rain settling into a steady pattern that spoke of clearing skies to come. Inside the warm kitchen, surrounded by voices and laughter and the comfortable chaos of people who'd worked together through a crisis, Boone felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. He felt like he was home. The visitor arrived on a Thursday morning, just as the women were hanging laundry on the line behind the house. Boone was in the barn shoeing his favorite mare when Tommy came running, his face tight with concern. "Boss, there's a man here to see you. Says his name's Harrison. Got a fancy buggy and clothes that cost more than I make in a year." Silas Harrison was indeed an impressive figure, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in the kind of Eastern finery that proclaimed wealth and authority. His buggy was polished to a high shine, pulled by matched bay horses that spoke of careful breeding and expensive maintenance. Everything about him suggested success and power, from his gold watch chain to his perfectly waxed mustache. He stood on Boone's front porch like he owned it, surveying the ranch with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. When Boone approached, Harrison extended a hand with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Boone Cartwright, I presume. I'm Silas Harrison. I own the Diamond H spread, about 30 miles south of here." Boone shook the offered hand, noting its softness against his own work-calloused palm. "Mr. Harrison, what brings you to the Silver Spur?" Harrison's smile was wide and white and didn't reach his eyes. "Business, my friend. The kind of business that could solve all your problems and make you a wealthy man in the bargain." Behind them, the women had paused in their work, drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar voice. Martha stood near the kitchen door, her expression watchful. The other women clustered nearby, their domestic tasks forgotten in the face of this unexpected intrusion. "I wasn't aware I had any problems," Boone replied carefully. Harrison's laugh was hearty and condescending. "Come now, Cartwright, a man your age, trying to run a spread this size with only 2 hands. And now I hear you've got a house full of women to feed and care for. That can't be easy on the finances." The casual dismissal of the women as burdens rather than assets made Boone's jaw tighten. "The ladies are guests, and my finances are my own concern." Of course," Harrison said smoothly, "but I'm here to make you an offer that could change everything. I'm prepared to buy the Silver Spur for a very generous price, more than fair market value, considering the challenges of ranching in this territory." The words hit Boone like a physical blow. Sell the Silver Spur? The ranch that he and Clara had built together, the land that held their dreams and her grave, the only home he'd known for 40 years. "This ranch isn't for sale," he said flatly. Harrison's expression shifted subtly, the friendly mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "Everything's for sale, Cartwright. It's just a matter of price. And I'm offering you the chance to walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your days." From the corner of his eye, Boone could see Martha moving closer, her green eyes fixed on Harrison with obvious distrust. The other women had stopped pretending to work, their attention focused entirely on the conversation taking place on the porch. "Why do you want my land?" Boone asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Harrison gestured expansively toward the horizon. "I'm building an empire, my friend. The Diamond H is already the largest spread in 3 counties, but I have vision. I see a time when one operation will control all the prime grazing land from here to the Colorado border." The ranch deed, locked safely in Boone's study, represented more than legal ownership. It was proof of everything he and Clara had worked for, everything they'd sacrificed to build. The thought of Harrison's hands on that document made his stomach turn. "I'm not interested," Boone said firmly. Harrison's smile turned cold. I think you should reconsider. Ranching is a young man's game, Cartwright. You're what, 65, 70? And now you've got 10 women depending on you. That's a heavy responsibility for a man in your position. Martha stepped forward then, her voice carrying the authority of someone who wouldn't be intimidated. Mr. Harrison, I think you've been misinformed. These ladies aren't depending on anyone. We're perfectly capable of taking care of ourselves. Harrison looked at her with the kind of patronizing smile men reserved for women they considered beneath their notice. I'm sure you mean well, ma'am, but this is business between men. Perhaps you should leave us to discuss it privately. The temperature on the porch seemed to drop 10 degrees. Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested Harrison had just made a serious tactical error. Perhaps, she said with deadly calm, you should remember that you're a guest on this ranch, speaking to people who've shown you courtesy you apparently don't deserve. Agnes Murphy appeared at Martha's shoulder, her schoolteacher's voice cutting through the tension. And perhaps you should understand that we women have as much stake in this conversation as anyone. Harrison's facade of friendliness cracked completely. Now see here. No, you see here. Ruth Henley interrupted, stepping up to join the growing line of women facing him down. This is Mr. Cartwright's ranch, and these are his decisions to make, not yours. Boone watched in amazement as the women formed a united front against Harrison's arrogance. These weren't helpless females seeking protection. They were formidable opponents defending what they'd come to consider their home. Harrison seemed to realize he'd badly misjudged the situation. He smoothed his mustache and attempted to regain his composure. I can see you need time to think about my offer, Cartwright. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often. There's nothing to think about, Boone replied. The Silver Spur stays in my hands. As Harrison climbed into his fancy buggy, his parting smile held a promise that made Boone's blood run cold. We'll see about that, old man. We'll see about that. After the dust from Harrison's departure had settled, the women gathered around Boone with expressions of concern and determination. Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch both comforting and steadying. That man's trouble, she said simply. Big trouble, Agnes agreed. I've seen his type before, men who think money gives them the right to take whatever they want. Sarah spoke up from where she'd been hanging shirts on the line. He's not going to give up easily, is he? Boone looked around at the faces surrounding him, women who'd traveled 1,000 miles, seeking new lives, who'd proven themselves capable of handling whatever challenges the prairie threw at them, who'd somehow become essential to the daily rhythm of his ranch. No, he said quietly. Men like Harrison don't give up easily. Elizabeth, who'd been quietly listening to the exchange, spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd faced down bullies before. Then we'll just have to make sure he understands that this ranch has more defenders than he bargained for. As the women returned to their work, Boone found himself watching them with new eyes. They weren't burdens or complications, they were allies. And for the first time since Harrison's arrival, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the Silver Spur would remain in the hands of people who truly valued it. Saturday, he realized with something approaching relief, suddenly seemed very far away indeed. The lawyer arrived on a Monday morning with the kind of precision that suggested his visit had been carefully timed. Samuel Morisano, relation to Jake, as he quickly clarified, was a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a leather satchel that bulged with official documents. Boone found him waiting on the front porch, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool autumn air. The women were in the kitchen preparing breakfast, their voices carrying through the open windows like music that had become as familiar as the sound of wind through prairie grass. Mr. Cartwright, Morrison said, rising from the porch chair where he'd been waiting. I represent the Boston Marriage Bureau, and I'm afraid we have a rather complicated legal situation on our hands. Martha appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar voice. Her expression was cautious but composed, the look of someone who'd learned to expect trouble but refused to be cowed by it. Legal situation? Boone asked, his stomach clenching with a familiar dread. Morrison opened his satchel and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. The marriage contracts, sir. It appears they're legally binding under territorial law, and there are significant implications for all parties involved. The word contracts hit the morning air like a thunderclap. Martha stepped onto the porch, her green eyes fixed on the lawyer with the intensity of someone who understood that their fate was about to be decided by men in suits who'd never lived a day on the frontier. "What kind of implications?" Martha asked, her voice steady despite the obvious concern in her expression. Morrison adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, ma'am. This is a matter of some delicacy." "These women have a right to know what affects them," Boone said firmly. "Speak plainly, Mr. Morrison." The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading from the topmost document. "The marriage contracts, as written and signed by the Boston Marriage Bureau, create a legal obligation on the part of Mr. Cartwright to provide for the welfare and security of the contracted parties until such time as proper marriages are consummated or alternative arrangements are legally established." Boone felt the world tilt sideways. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means, sir, that under territorial law, you are legally responsible for these ladies' welfare. They cannot simply be sent away without proper provision for their future security." Martha sank into the porch chair Morrison had vacated, her face pale but her spine straight. "And if no such provision is made?" Morrison consulted his papers again. "The women would be considered abandoned under territorial statutes, which could result in significant legal penalties for Mr. Cartwright, including potential seizure of property to ensure adequate support." The implications crashed over Boone like a cold wave. Harrison's visit suddenly made sense. The timing, the pressure to sell, the confident assumption that Boone would eventually see reason. Somehow, the neighboring rancher had known about the legal complications before Boone himself had been informed. "How did Harrison know about this?" Boone asked suddenly. Morrison's nervous fidgeting increased. "I'm not at liberty to discuss my other clients, sir, but I will say that Mr. Harrison has been making inquiries about the legal status of various properties in the territory." "You work for Harrison," Martha said, and it wasn't a question. The lawyer's silence was answer enough. Agnes Murphy emerged from the kitchen, followed by the other women, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation they could hear unfolding on the porch. "So this is Harrison's game," Ruth said quietly. "Force Mr. Cartwright into an impossible situation, then swoop in with a solution that benefits only himself." Elizabeth Crawford, her voice sharp with the anger of someone who'd been manipulated before, stepped forward. "What exactly does the law require, Mr. Morrison? And don't give us any more legal double talk." Morrison pulled out yet another document, the original marriage contract that had started the entire situation. The paper was worn from handling, creased and stained from the long journey west, but the legal language was clear and binding. Either Mr. Cartwright must enter into marriage contracts with willing parties, provide adequate financial settlements for those who choose not to marry, or demonstrate that alternative arrangements have been made for their welfare and security. "And if he can't do any of those things?" Sarah asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "The territorial court could order the sale of sufficient property to meet the legal obligations." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of understanding. Harrison had engineered this entire situation, using the women's arrival and the legal complications to force Boone into a position where selling the ranch would seem like the only rational choice. Agnes spoke first, her schoolteacher's practicality cutting through the emotional turmoil. "How much time do we have?" "The territorial court meets monthly. I'm required to file a report on the situation within 30 days, or by the next court session, whichever comes first." 2 weeks, Martha calculated aloud. "We have 2 weeks to resolve this situation." Helen Torres, who'd been quietly listening to the legal maneuvering, stepped forward with the directness of someone who'd faced down adversity before. "Then we need to understand our options clearly. Mr. Morrison, would you be so kind as to explain exactly what constitutes adequate provision under the law?" Morrison consulted his papers again, his nervousness increasing as he realized the women weren't going to be dismissed or intimidated. Marriage to suitable partners, sufficient financial settlement to ensure independent living, or demonstrated integration into the community with adequate means of support. Tommy Chen emerged from the barn, drawn by the unusual gathering on the porch. His eyes immediately sought out Mary, and Boone caught the young man's expression of concern as he realized something serious was happening. "What about work?" Mary asked suddenly. "If we're employed, earning our own living, would that satisfy the legal requirements?" Morrison blinked in surprise. "Aye. That would be unusual for ladies of your station, but theoretically, yes. Demonstrated ability to support themselves would meet the legal standard." Jake Morrison appeared from the direction of the corral, his injured arm still in a sling but his step steady. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd weathered many storms, both natural and man-made. "Boss," he said quietly, "whatever this is about, you know Tommy and I stand with you." The simple declaration of loyalty seemed to break through the legal fog that had settled over the group. These people, the women who'd traveled so far, the men who'd worked beside him for years, had become more than employees or temporary guests. They'd become family. Boone looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing determination where Harrison had expected desperation, unity where he'd counted on division. The neighboring rancher had made a serious miscalculation in thinking that legal pressure would force an easy victory. "Mr. Morrison," Boone said slowly, his voice carrying a new note of resolve, "I think you can tell Mr. Harrison that the Silver Spur Ranch isn't going anywhere, and neither are the people who've made it their home." The lawyer packed his papers with obvious reluctance, understanding that his mission had failed to achieve its intended result. As his buggy disappeared down the dusty road, the group on the porch stood together in the morning sun, facing an uncertain future but no longer facing it alone. Martha reached over and took Boone's weathered hand in her own, her touch warm and steady. "We'll figure this out," she said simply, "together." For the first time since the lawyer's arrival, Boone allowed himself to believe that might actually be true. Harrison might have legal weapons and financial resources, but the Silver Spur had something more powerful: people who were willing to fight for what mattered. And what mattered, Boone was beginning to understand, wasn't just the land or the buildings or even the cattle. What mattered was the home they'd all found together, against all odds and expectations. The battle for the Silver Spur was about to begin in earnest, but for the first time in 30 years, Boone Cartwright wasn't facing it alone. The decision came to Boone in the quiet hours before dawn, as he sat on his front porch, watching the stars fade into the grey light of morning. 2 weeks had passed since Morrison's visit, and tomorrow the territorial court would convene to hear the case that could determine the fate of everything he'd spent his life building. But it wasn't the legal threats that had kept him awake through the night. It was the realization that somewhere in the past weeks, his reasons for fighting had changed completely. He was no longer fighting to preserve the past, was fighting to protect a future he'd never dared to imagine. Inside the house, he could hear the familiar sounds of morning preparations. Martha's voice directing the breakfast preparations, Ruth checking on Jake's healing arm, Agnes organizing the day's tasks with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing unruly schoolchildren. These sounds had become the soundtrack of his days, as essential as the lowing of cattle or the whisper of wind through grass. The screen door opened behind him, and Martha stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd taken to joining him for these quiet morning moments, understanding his need for reflection without feeling compelled to fill the silence with unnecessary words. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Been thinking," Boone replied, accepting the coffee gratefully, "about what needs to be done." Martha studied his profile in the growing light, noting the new lines of determination around his eyes. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun edge above the horizon and paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. "I'm not selling the ranch," he said finally. "Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, the Silver Spur stays in the hands of people who love it." "Even if it means," Martha started. "Especially if it means—" Boone interrupted gently. "Martha, these past weeks have shown me something I thought I'd lost forever. This place isn't just a ranch anymore. It's a home again, filled with people who matter." Martha set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. "Boone, what are you saying?" He met her eyes directly, seeing in them the same courage and determination that had brought her across a continent on nothing but hope. "I'm saying that if the law requires marriages or financial settlements or proof of community integration, then maybe it's time to stop fighting what everyone can see is already happening." The words hung in the morning air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Martha's hand found his on the arm of his chair, her touch warm and steady. "And what exactly is already happening?" she asked softly. Boone turned his hand palm up, letting her fingers intertwine with his. "You know what's happening, Martha. We all do. Tommy's been mooning over Mary for 2 weeks. Jake lights up like a Christmas tree whenever Ruth tends to his arm, and Agnes has been teaching Elizabeth to read sign language so she can communicate better with the deaf boy in town." Martha smiled, recognizing the truth in his observations. "And what about us, Boone? What's happening with us?" The question he'd been avoiding for weeks hung between them like a bridge neither had been brave enough to cross. Boone looked at this remarkable woman who'd somehow found her way into his carefully guarded heart, who'd proven herself capable of matching his strength while offering a tenderness he'd forgotten he needed. "I think," he said carefully, "that I'm falling in love with you, Martha Sullivan. And that scares me more than any legal threat Harrison could devise." Martha's smile was radiant, transforming her face with joy and relief. "Then we're both terrified," she said, "because I fell in love with you the night of the storm, when you caught me in the barn, and I realized I felt safer in your arms than I'd felt anywhere in 20 years. They sat together in the growing daylight, hands clasped, both understanding that they'd just crossed a threshold that would change everything. Behind them, the house began to stir with the sounds of a large household waking up women who'd become sisters, men who'd become brothers, all of them forming the kind of chosen family that frontier life sometimes created from the most unlikely circumstances. "There's something I need to show you," Boone said, rising from his chair. "Something I should have dealt with years ago." He led Martha upstairs to the room that had been his and Clara's, to the trunk at the foot of the bed that he'd kept locked for 30 years. His hands shook slightly as he turned the key, lifting the lid to reveal treasures he'd been unable to look at since Clara's death. There, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was Clara's wedding dress ivory silk, with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It was a dress meant for joy and new beginnings, not for gathering dust in a trunk while its owner clung to the past. "She was beautiful," Martha said softly, touching the fabric with reverent fingers. "She was," Boone agreed, "and she would have wanted this dress to be worn again by someone who understood its significance." Martha looked up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Boone, I can't." "You can," he said firmly. "Clara believed in love, Martha. She believed in marriage and family and building something that would last. She would never have wanted this dress to become a shrine to the past when it could be a celebration of the future." Downstairs, they could hear the others beginning their day. Agnes was reading the morning news aloud to anyone who would listen, while Helen and Sarah discussed plans for expanding the vegetable garden. Elizabeth was helping Ruth prepare medications for the day, their conversation mixing medical knowledge with gentle gossip about the various romances blooming around the ranch. "We'll need to act quickly," Martha said, her practical nature reasserting itself. "The court session is tomorrow." Boone nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. Tommy and Mary first, they're young and eager, and their feelings are written all over their faces. Then Jake and Ruth, if they're willing. Agnes might be harder to convince, but I think she and that widower from town, Patterson, have been corresponding. "And Elizabeth?" Martha asked. "Elizabeth's found her purpose, helping Ruth with medical work. She might choose independence over marriage, and that's her right." Martha carefully refolded Clara's wedding dress, understanding the trust Boone was placing in her by sharing this most precious possession. "What about the others?" Helen, Sarah, they deserve the same chance at happiness. Then we'll make sure they have it. Boone said with growing conviction. This ranch is big enough for all of us, Martha. Big enough for marriages and single women and anyone else who wants to call it home. They spent the morning in quiet consultation with the other residents of the ranch, gauging feelings and possibilities. Tommy's face lit up like sunrise when Boone mentioned Mary's interest, while Mary herself blushed prettily but didn't deny her growing affection for the gentle young man. Jake was more circumspect, but his eyes sought out Ruth with obvious longing. "She's too good for an old cowpoke like me," he protested, but without much conviction. "Let Ruth decide that," Martha suggested gently, and when Ruth was consulted, her response was immediate and practical. "That man has the kindest heart and the steadiest hands of anyone I've ever known," she said firmly. "If he's asking, the answer is yes." Agnes surprised everyone by revealing her correspondence with Patterson, the widowed shopkeeper from town. "He's been writing for weeks," she admitted with a blush that made her look 20 years younger. "Asking if I might consider a permanent position as teacher in town, with all that such a position might entail." Elizabeth, as predicted, chose independence, but with a twist that spoke to her generous heart. "I'd like to stay and help Ruth establish a proper medical practice," she said. "The territory needs trained medical personnel, and I can provide assistance while learning more myself." Sarah and Helen, after much discussion, decided to pool their resources and establish a business in Toner boarding house that could serve the growing number of travelers and new settlers arriving in the territory. As the day progressed, plans took shape with the efficiency of people who understood that time was precious and opportunities fleeting. By evening, they had a strategy that would satisfy the legal requirements while preserving the essential character of what they'd all built together. The Silver Spur would remain in Boone's hands, but it would also become something larger, home base for an extended family that would spread throughout the territory, connected by bonds, stronger than blood and more enduring than legal documents. As the sun set on what might be their last evening before everything changed, the household gathered around the kitchen table for supper. Faces that had been strange 2 weeks ago now seemed as familiar as sunrise. Voices that had once been foreign now formed the chorus of home. Tomorrow would bring the territorial court, Harrison's machinations, and the legal battle that would determine their future. But tonight, surrounded by the people he'd learned to love, Boone Cartwright felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. He felt hopeful about tomorrow. And for a man who'd spent 3 decades living in yesterday, that was nothing short of miraculous. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity when Judge William Harrisono, relation to Silas, despite the shared name, called the morning session to order. Word of the unusual case had spread throughout the territory, drawing curious onlookers, potential business partners, and more than a few people who had their own opinions about mail-order marriages and women's rights on the frontier. Boone sat at the plaintiff's table with Martha beside him, her presence both comforting and strengthening. Behind them, the other women filled the first row of spectator seats, their faces showing the calm determination of people who'd decided their fate wouldn't be decided by others without a fight. Silas Harrison occupied the defendant's table with his own lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Denver who'd arrived on the morning train with a briefcase full of legal precedents and territorial statutes. Harrison's confidence was evident in his posture and expression. He clearly expected this to be a formality before claiming his prize. "This court will hear the case of Morrison versus Cartwright," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd presided over frontier justice for 20 years. "The Territorial Marriage Bureau alleges breach of contract and seeks resolution of financial obligations." Morrison stood nervously, consulting his papers before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the defendant, Boone Cartwright, entered into binding marriage contracts through the Boston Marriage Bureau. 10 women traveled to his ranch based on these contracts, but he has refused to honor his obligations." "And what relief does the plaintiff seek?" the judge asked. Harrison's lawyer, Webster, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, My client has offered a reasonable solution purchase of the defendant's ranch at fair market value, which would provide adequate funds to meet all legal obligations to the affected women. Judge Harrison's expression suggested he wasn't impressed by the transparency of the maneuver. And Mr. Cartwright's position? Boone stood slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Your Honor, I never signed any marriage contracts. But I don't dispute my moral obligation to these ladies who traveled here in good faith. Then how do you propose to resolve the situation? The judge asked. Martha rose beside Boone, her voice clear and strong. Your Honor, if I may address the court, I believe there are solutions that don't require anyone to lose their home or livelihood. Webster objected immediately. Your Honor, this woman has no legal standing in these proceedings. She has every standing, Judge Harrison replied firmly. She's one of the affected parties. I'll hear what she has to say. Martha stepped forward, and Boone was struck again by her natural dignity and presence. Your Honor, the law requires adequate provision for our welfare and security. We believe we can demonstrate that such provision has been made. How so? The judge asked. Tommy Chen and Mary Chen request permission to present themselves for marriage, Martha announced. Jake Morrison and Ruth Henley likewise request the court's recognition of their intention to marry. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Tommy and Mary stood, followed by Jake and Ruth. The four of them moved to stand before the judge's bench, their faces showing nervous but determined resolve. Agnes Murphy has accepted a position as schoolteacher in town and a proposal of marriage from Thomas Patterson, Martha continued, as Agnes rose with a dignified nod. Elizabeth Crawford will remain at the Silver Spur as medical assistant to Ruth Morrison. Mrs. Morrison has demonstrated independent means of support through her medical practice. And Sarah Mitchell and Helen Torres have established a boarding house business in town, with adequate capital and community support. Judge Harrison reviewed the papers Martha had submitted, his expression thoughtful. These are all voluntary arrangements. Completely voluntary, Your Honor, Martha replied. Each woman has chosen her own path to security and happiness. Webster stood quickly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The original contracts specified marriage to the defendant, not to various other parties. The law requires adequate provision, Judge Harrison replied dryly. It doesn't specify the exact nature of that provision. Silas Harrison's face was turning red with frustration. He leaned over to whisper urgently to his lawyer, who nodded and stood again. Your Honor, there's still the matter of the primary contract holder, this woman, Martha Sullivan. No provision has been made for her situation. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to Martha. This was the moment everything hinged on the question that would determine whether their carefully constructed solution would satisfy the court's requirements. Martha looked back at Boone, her green eyes calm and certain. He nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding passing between them without need for words. Your Honor, Martha said clearly, Boone Cartwright and I request permission to present ourselves for marriage. The words rang out in the sudden quiet of the courtroom like a bell announcing new possibilities. Behind them, the other women smiled with quiet satisfaction, while Harrison's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching panic. Judge Harrison looked from Martha to Boone, his weathered face showing the hint of a smile. And is this arrangement voluntary on both parts? Completely voluntary, Your Honor, Boone said, his voice steady and sure. More than voluntary, it's what we both want. The foundation of Harrison's legal strategy was crumbling before his eyes, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. But Silas Harrison wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily, and the look in his eyes suggested the battle was far from over. Webster wasn't finished. He stood with the aggressive posture of a man playing his final card, his voice cutting through the courtroom's murmur of approval. Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding. These so-called voluntary arrangements are clearly a sham designed to circumvent the legitimate legal obligations of the defendant. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. On what grounds, Counselor? The defendant lacks the financial means to support multiple households, Your Honor. My client's investigation has revealed significant debts and declining ranch revenues. These marriages would simply transfer the financial burden to other parties without adequate resources. The accusation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Boone felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment as Harrison's lawyer continued his assault. Furthermore, Webster pressed on, Mr. Cartwright's age and declining health make him unsuitable for marriage to a woman in her prime. This arrangement is nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid the reasonable solution my client has offered. Martha's hand found Boone's arm, steadying him as he started to rise in protest. Her touch reminded him that losing his temper would only prove Webster's point about his unsuitability. "Your Honor," Martha said, her voice cutting through Webster's rhetoric with quiet authority, "I'd like to address these accusations directly." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather pouch, the contents of which she emptied onto the court clerk's desk. Silver coins glinted in the courtroom's dusty light, more money than most frontier families saw in a year. "This is my contribution to our partnership," Martha announced. "The proceeds from selling my property in Boston, invested carefully during my journey west. I'm not a penniless woman seeking a meal ticket, Mr. Webster. I'm a woman of independent means, choosing to build a life with a man I love." Ruth Henley rose from her seat, her medical bag in hand. "Your Honor, might I also address the court? I'm a trained medical practitioner with 20 years of experience. I've already begun establishing a practice here, and my services are in high demand throughout the territory." Agnes Murphy stood as well, her schoolteacher's confidence evident in her bearing. "The Territorial School Board has offered me a permanent position at double my previous salary. The need for educated teachers is critical here." One by one, the other women rose to demonstrate their capabilities and resources. Sarah and Helen presented a detailed business plan for their boarding house, complete with letters of credit from their bank in Boston. Mary displayed samples of her skilled needlework, already in demand among the town's women. Elizabeth opened a medical journal to an article she'd written about frontier medicine, published in a Philadelphia medical publication. "I'm not seeking charity, Your Honor. I'm seeking the opportunity to use my skills where they're most needed." Webster found himself facing a wall of competent, articulate women who systematically dismantled every assumption his case had been built upon. But Silas Harrison whispered urgently in his ear, and the lawyer nodded grimly. "Your Honor," Webster said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "these women may have resources now, but territorial law is clear about the obligations of marriage contracts. If Mr. Cartwright disowned at his advanced age, that's a significant possibility. His estate would be responsible for their welfare. My client's offer remains the only practical solution." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Boone felt something cold settle in his stomach. Webster was right about one thing at 62. He wasn't a young man, and frontier life didn't offer guarantees about longevity. But Martha stepped forward again, and this time her voice carried a steel that made the entire courtroom sit up and take notice. "Mr. Webster, are you suggesting that love and marriage should be decided by actuarial tables, that women should be treated like livestock to be sold to the highest bidder?" She turned to address the judge directly, her green eyes blazing with conviction. "Your Honor, I buried one husband after 20 years of marriage. I know the risks of loving someone, and I know the pain of loss. But I also know that a life lived in fear of loss is no life at all." From her pocket, she withdrew a small silver ring, simple, unadorned, but crafted with obvious care. "Boone made this for me from silver found on his ranch. It represents a partnership built on respect, affection, and shared purpose. Not a financial transaction, not a legal obligation, but a choice made by two people who understand the value of what they've found together." Judge Harrison had been listening to the proceedings with growing interest, and now he leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Cartwright, do you have anything to add?" Boone rose slowly, his weathered hands steady as he looked around the courtroom. "Your Honor, 30 years ago I thought my life was over when I lost my wife. These women and the men who work beside me have shown me that life doesn't end when we lose someone we love. It just changes direction." He looked directly at Silas Harrison, his voice carrying decades of quiet strength. I'm not selling my ranch to a man who sees people as obstacles to his ambitions. The Silver Spur will remain in the hands of people who understand that a home is worth more than its market value." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, then rapped his gavel once. "The court will recess for 1 hour while I consider the evidence presented." As the courtroom erupted in conversation, Martha slipped the silver ring onto her finger, and Boone understood that regardless of the judge's decision, they had already won the only victory that truly mattered. 6 months later, the Silver Spur Ranch looked nothing like the quiet, solitary place Boone had inhabited for 30 years. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the yard, where Tommy and Mary's twin boys played under the watchful eye of their grandmother, Mary's mother, who'd come west for the wedding and decided to stay. The vegetable garden had expanded to feed the growing household, and a new barn was being built to accommodate the additional livestock that prosperity had brought. Boone stood on his front porch, watching the controlled chaos of his transformed world with the contentment of a man who'd finally learned to distinguish between solitude and loneliness. The porch itself bore witness to the change-stwo rocking chairs instead of one, a small table where Martha kept her knitting, and flower boxes that bloomed with the wildflowers she'd learned to love as much as he did. Martha emerged from the house, her hair now showing silver threads that caught the afternoon sun. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and her movements carried the easy confidence of a woman completely at home in her surroundings. "The photographer's here," she announced, settling into the chair beside him. "Ruth insists we need a proper family portrait before everyone scatters to their various activities." Through the screen door, they could hear Ruth Morrisonshade taken Jake's name with obvious pride, organizing the household with the efficiency of someone who'd found her calling. Her medical practice had grown beyond anything she'd imagined possible in Boston, and she'd recently taken on an apprentice, a young woman from town who showed real aptitude for healing. Agnes Patterson could be seen through the kitchen window, helping her new stepdaughter with arithmetic while keeping an eye on the bread baking in the oven. Her marriage to Thomas had been a quiet affair, but their partnership had brought stability to both their lives and greatly improved the education available to local children. Elizabeth Crawford appeared in the doorway of what had once been Clara's sewing room, now converted into a proper medical office. She was reviewing notes with Dr. James Mitchell, the territory's new physician who'd arrived from Denver specifically to work with the established medical practice. Elizabeth had never married, but her life was full of purpose and satisfaction in ways that transcended traditional expectations. Sarah and Helen's boarding house in town had become the social center of the growing community, hosting everything from church socials to political meetings. They'd expanded twice in 6 months and were already planning a third edition to accommodate the steady stream of new settlers arriving in the territory. Judge Harrison's decision was the right one, Martha said, her hand finding Boone's on the arm of his chair. The silver ring she wore caught the light, its simple design more precious to her than any elaborate jewelry could have been. The judge had ruled decisively in their favor, declaring that the voluntary arrangements satisfied all legal requirements and exceeded the spirit of territorial law regarding women's welfare. More importantly, he'd issued a sharp rebuke to Harrison's attempt to manipulate the legal system for personal gain, noting that the court's purpose was to ensure justice, not to facilitate business acquisitions. Harrison had left town the next day, his grand plans for territorial domination crumbling in the face of people who understood that some things couldn't be bought or bullied. His ranch still operated south of them, but under new management that respected boundaries and understood the value of good neighbors. Tommy appeared around the corner of the house, leading his horse and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd just completed a job well done. "Fences finished, boss," he called out. "That north pasture should hold the cattle through the winter now." Mary followed him, her sons trailing behind her like ducklings. Marriage and motherhood had given her a glow that made her more beautiful than ever, and the way Tommy looked at her suggested that the passage of time had only deepened his affection. "The photographer's waiting," Mary reminded them, unconsciously smoothing her hair in the way of women who wanted to look their best for posterity. Jake emerged from the barn, his arm fully healed and his step steady. He'd thrown himself into ranch work with renewed energy, understanding that he was no longer just an employee, but a full partner in an enterprise that had become something much larger than any of them had originally envisioned. As the extended family gathered on the front porch for their portrait, Boone marveled at the faces surrounding him. These people had arrived as strangers, brought together by a clerical error and circumstances none of them could have predicted. But they'd chosen to stay, to build something together, to create the kind of family that had nothing to do with blood relations and everything to do with shared commitment and affection. The photographer, a serious young man from Cheyenne, positioned them carefully, the married couples together, the children in front, the single adults arranged to create a pleasing composition. But what the camera would capture wasn't just their physical arrangement. It would preserve a moment when 10 strangers and one lonely widower had become something precious and enduring. "Everyone ready?" the photographer called out, his hand poised over the camera's mechanism. Boone looked around at the faces that had become dear to him: Martha's steady strength, Ruth's gentle competence, Agnes's quiet wisdom, Elizabeth's determined independence. He saw Tommy's contentment, Jake's renewed purpose, Mary's joy, and Sarah and Helen's entrepreneurial satisfaction. "Ready," he replied, though the word encompassed so much more than preparation for a photograph. As the camera captured their image, preserving this moment for future generations to discover, Boone understood that he'd learned something precious in his 63rd year. Love wasn't always a lightning strike that transformed everything in an instant. Sometimes it was a slow, steady campfire that warmed you gradually, built from the simple materials of daily kindness, shared work, and the decision to care for each other, despite perhaps because of life's uncertainties. The Silver Spur Ranch would endure, but more importantly, so would the family that called it home. And on this golden afternoon, with the Wyoming sky stretching endlessly above them and the future bright with possibility, that was enough.